Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Buenas tardes a todas y a todos.
Good afternoon to you all, and salam alaikum. Within this meeting for an Alliance of Civilizations, we are going to start this round table, whose motto is the Alliance of Civilizations and Identity as a Guarantee of a Fair and Solidarian Globalization. At this round table, we will be listening to Mr. Muhammad Siharuddin Sianzuddin. No? You're giving the wrong name. You've been given the wrong name. The rest is okay. Yeah, it's Shamsuddin, but it is Shamsuddin Elia, the director for Historic Studies of the Argentinian Republic. Mr. Javier Rodriguez Ramos, professor of civil law, who will talk to us about cultural identity and global citizenship. And on my left, Mr. Jacob Bender, a filmmaker and documentary director, and also Ms. Pérez Callejon, who will give to the attendees the text of an essay on a proposal for recovering the spirit of Arabia. And my name is Hashim Cabrera, and I'll be talking about identity and contemporaneity. And once said this, I would now go on for telling you about the basic subject gathering us here together. It's a subject having to do with memory, with history, and also with the process we are going through right now. We're living that we refer to as globalization, and such globalization is bringing out to light a series of contradictions. Some of them, especially the ones having to do with identity, are the ones we're going to deal with, God wishing, during the afternoon. This globalization process particularly affecting all peoples and cultures in the world, and is making for a series of identities to come out, identities which are not always consistent among each other, sometimes even appear as contradictory. On the one side, we see a series of identities coming out, a series of closed identities, identifications with models, with words, with ideas, which fix a series of stereotypes, mainly based on ideas of exclusion, confrontation, lack of identity as a risk and a peril for human relationships. Basically, that identity model, that exclusion model, is represented by the economic model, neoliberalism, which is living a trail of destruction the world over. We all know of the international situation. The people are being decimated, are the victims of genocides, and on the other hand, also we see emerging identities which are looking for dialogue, for an open identity which brings in solutions rather than problems. And that identity problem, that problem between that close and excluding reality and a more open identity, is not a new phenomenon. We're today at a city, a place where such a problem was present for a long time. When we talk about an alliance of civilizations, we're almost being a bit reiterative, because all civilizations are based in dialogue, in mutual recognition, because the opposite to civilization is just barbarism.
Uno de los momentos y una de las sociedades en las que esa alianza
city was a place where that universal humanism could reach a lasting expression. And today we talk about Maimonides, Averroes, we talk about rationalism and Al-Andalus. Most speeches this evening have got to do with Al-Andalus, and we talk about the splendor of philosophy. We already talk, we start acknowledging that Al-Andalus was the intellectual president, scientific president of European modernity, of Renaissance, of illustration. But usually we forget of something which is deeper from my point of view, and which is still not so evident. 200 years ago, before even Rushd, Averroes, for the European culture, 200 years before the Almohads in the Cordoba, at which Al-Hakam II reigned, there was a thinker, Ibn Mazara, who, when traveling to Mecca, when doing his pilgrimage, could contact the Muslims who gathered by that time in Basra, in what's present-day Iraq, and that group inside the Caliphate of the Abbasids gather thinkers and scientists from all traditions and cultures, and that group of thinkers, who were later on to be called the Wana Safa, the Brethren of Purity, was a group made up of people from all cultures and nations and races, and they developed an intellectual effort in order to describe or study a view of the human being, a humanism, a humanistic view, which, apart from being rational, took into account the world of soul. Even Mazara, when coming back from the East, when he wanted to disseminate his ideas in that Cordoba, the Caliphate, was punished by the ulemas, and in the end, that wisdom was not triumphant. It was just philosophy and rationalism which triumphed, and that gave rise to a series of technological improvements, improvements of many different kinds, but it left behind something which is very important, such as the world of soul. When we're living through that transition, that globalization between the world of exclusion, of the clash of civilizations, of distraction, and that other world of alliance and encounter, we are also claiming for a coming back to that transcendental humanism, that cosmic view, cosmic vision, which, despite being very scientific and rational, still takes into account the world of soul, the spiritual world, and the world of those realities which, even if immaterial, are truly existent. At the time of Ibn Mazara, the thinker, the wise man, didn't see a difference between reason and revelation. Rationalism made that division later on, and it is science today, the most contemporary science of the avant-garde, what is telling us that there's no contradiction between reason and revelation, or between faith and reason. There are invisible worlds, quantic energies, unsurmountable worlds, and when scientists talk to us, still believers are shy to refer to the angels, for example. But science is becoming unashamed of the invisible world. And alhamdulillah, thanks to God, at this moment of transition between that mechanicistic paradigm and that other holistic universal world at which we are immersed, we sing together once again rationality, spirituality, and the different traditions, religions, and cultures. And it is a reason for joy for me, and I am especially happy as a man of Cordoba and as Andalusian that it is here in Cordoba, 1,000 years later, talking and trying to make proposals for a model of living, a humanistic model which involves a series of values, and that is being done in a city which was the place from that Fahitme arrived to the east and came back to the west in modern times. And I'm also happy about it because this shows, of course, that the evolution is possible, that we can evolve in around technological aspects, but of course the main problems of mankind are invariable. We can choose our identity, both as individuals and peoples. We can choose between becoming identified with what's relative and dies, or with that which is non-disappearing. We can identify ourselves with a certain philosophy or ethnic group or a culture, but all that will in the end die. But if we try to identify ourselves to a certain reality, that task will always be there, because we will never reach an end to that. Because when we discover it, we will have by that time disappeared. So that's all. To give now the floor to my colleagues, to my brethren, so they can themselves give us their view and their reading of this subject, of such a complex subject, so difficult as identities. So now I would like to give the floor to Sahudin Elias, so he can talk to us about that subject with regards al-Andalus.
En el nombre de Dios, graciabilísimo y misericordiosísimo.
In the name of God, it is very true what brother said, independently of one important subject, which is globalization. When Al-Andalus existed, and also the rest of the Muslim world, we could say that there was a well-understood globalization. And rather than asserting it, we could put on the table specific, tangible proofs of it. By the mid-12th century, around 1260, a famous Jewish traveler, Benjamin of Tudela, could make a trip from the Iberian Peninsula to the east while crossing Muslim territories. Some of them weren't Muslim, and he reached the heart of Persia. He crossed through Palestine, he reached Iraq, he visited Baghdad, and in his travel book, which can be found here in bookshops, it is interesting to find how he himself, nowhere he said that he had to produce a passport or any kind of visa. And he was Jewish, and he was considered to be a brother, and no one put any hurdle for him to travel all throughout the Muslim world. It was a very long trip from Spain up to the heart of Persia in current Iran, and that, I think, is what can be referred to as a well-understood globalization. For a traveler to do this, to make the same trip today, he would have to have several visas, an accredited passport, and somewhere he would, in some places, he would be forced to give some explanations of it, for the reasons of his trip. First, in the short time I have, I would like to give you some explanations, especially with regards to the subject of Al-Andalus, and specifically Al-Andalus with the here and the there. When we are in Argentina, there is here, and when we are in Spain, there is where Argentina is. But in any case, I'm going to now talk about this area of the world, especially the first Hispanic Muslims who reached America, and specifically Argentina. This, on the one side, is a fascinating subject, and at the same time, not very much known a thing. Even if we all know that here in Spain, at the most important universities, we have departments of Arab and Islamic studies. We also know that there are no specialists who know about Moresque studies in America. Morisco studies in America, but all those studies have got to do, the few of them which exist, have got to do with the prevalence here in Spain. I've got a friend, Francisco Márquez Villanueva from Harvard University, and he confessed that that's true, that there are no studies of that kind, and there's an incredible background, a very long history of the Moriscos in the southern cone around the River Plate, and it's not so long ago that we started discovering it, and there's a task for reconstruction which, even if it's extraordinary, it's also very difficult, because during the last 500 years no studies have been made on these people, so it's very difficult to find the tracks, the trails they followed. But we've got some patterns, something which is perhaps the most apparent of this issue, the issue of Mudéjar art in America. This art follows a series of parameters, and it's easy to check it, to find it. We find it in Mexico, in Cuba, in Venezuela, in Ecuador, in Peru, in Bolivia, in Chile, in Argentina, in Paraguay, and even in Brazil. This Mudéjar art came to Brazil through Portugal, so it also came from Al-Andalus. That's why everywhere in America, this art, on the one side, the specialist refer to Mudéjar art, but is referred to as Spanish colonial art. But then what you will find there is Nasri art, Andalusian art in general, of course, with foreseeable changes brought about by time. But you will also find a series of pieces of equestrian culture in Southern America and also in the Caribbean. I may be quoting, for example, some biotypes. In Colombia and Venezuela, we have the llaneros, and especially we have the huasos in Chile and the gauchos in Argentina, Uruguay, and southern Brazil. These equestrian cultures are no other thing but what was inherited from Al-Andalus, especially everything having to do with horses from the Umayyad periods and from the Taifa period, and also the ones descending from the Nasri Sultanate of Granada. And especially all those traces having to do with the Berber tribes, especially the Sanata tribe. The word we use for referring to a jockey comes from Zenete, from the Zanata tribe in the Berber area of the Maghreb. So we've got a tradition in that, and there was a strong Hispanic Muslim presence. And the most interesting feature is that these influences and presences may be found not just through uses, but also at specific elements such as the clothing, gastronomy, and language. And specifically around the River Plate,
Yeísmo y ceseo.
we have the Yeísmo and the ceseo, which is the special way in which the double L and the S is pronounced in Argentina. Instead of saying cocina, the Spanish word for kitchen, they say cocina. And this is an Arab influence. The first groups of Spaniards reaching America, most of them where were they coming from? From Andalusia, and especially from these ports, Palos de Moguer, Huelva, Sanlúcar de Barrameda. And most of the crews during the two first centuries were made up of newly converted Christians, that is, Moriscos. And Rodrigo de Triana, specifically the Spaniard who first saw the land, was a newly converted Christian.
Ni tampoco un especialista de...
This is not coming from a different specialist, but is Rafael Lapesa y Melgar, the Spanish philologist, who was the most important student of the great Hispanist Menéndez Pidal. He visited Argentina many times, and he quoted it at a speech he delivered at the Faculty of Philosophy and Arts of the University of Buenos Aires. Another Spanish specialist who certified it was Américo Castro. In his book, Spain in History, he says that, for example, in Argentina, the overcoat for a man is called in Spanish sobre todo, which in English means overall. But for women, they call it tapado, like something which is hidden or secluded. In fact, it refers to a woman which is cloaked or covered, and is related to the traditions of the Moresque tradition. There's, for example, a story about the tapadas, the women of Lima in Peru, and there are also traces in gastronomy. And we've got a specialist for that on that subject. There's a professor of the University of Rosario in Argentina again, who's finished his research through a series of books. One of them is called the Hidden Conquest. Her name is Elvira Sagarzazu. She's delivered her speeches in different countries, among them Tunis, and he shows a series of patterns in cooking which are related to the presence of Moriscos in the River Plate, or around the region of the River Plate. And she says that there's a series of delicacies, of tastes, of dishes which come from the Morisco tradition. A series of pastries or of salted pieces of bakery, and they were elements which came by the hand of Berber and Persian Muslims to the Iberian Peninsula. I was talking with one of our brothers, and he told me that especially in the area of Valencia, there's the ensaimada, and among other things, one of the favorite juices Andalusians had is arrope, which is a kind of concentrate of fruit juice. It's a kind of syrup. And they found that in the region, when they came to the River Plate, there were almost no fruits. And they applied the same recipe, but instead of concentrating fruit juice, they concentrated milk and sugar, and that's the origin of that famous sweet called dulce de leche. Ibn Khaldun, the great Muslim historian of the 14th century, it was its 600th anniversary last year, he was saying that the past and the future are close to each other like two drops of water are. And if we have this series of specific data on the coexistence here in the Al-Andalus with characters such as the Chancellor of Abdel Rahman III, Ibn al-Rushd, and on the coexistence in Granada and Cordoba, or in the period of the Taifa kingdoms, and there's a series of other patterns, for example, the meeting between Saint Francis and a caliph, we will see that we've got there all the ingredients for talking about coexistence. It is just an issue of knowing what we are talking about and bringing it down to practical terms. Of course, it is not an easy thing to do, but we've got all patterns, all ingredients for giving it shape. It is very interesting, and I also wanted to refer to that as something related to this Al-Andalus and that Al-Andalus, or the Al-Andalus, the small Al-Andalus we had there for 500 years. And it is the fact that by the mid-15th century, Father Juan de Segovia did the first direct translation, together with the help of a Muslim sheikh, of the sacred Quran directly from Arab to Spanish. And we've got that commentary of these specialists, Darío Cabanelas, on the subject of the trilingual Quran of Juan de Segovia. There was an edition with a Latin version by Robert de Ketton and Pedro el Venerable from the middle of the 12th century, then the Arab version and the translation into Spanish. The most interesting thing is that right after 500 years of that translation made by Juan de Segovia, in Buenos Aires, the second direct translation from Arab to Spanish was made by a Lebanese Muslim who settled in Argentina, Professor Ahmed Aboud. Translation which was published by the end of 1952. A year after, we will see the third direct translation made by Professor Juan Bernet of Barcelona. But the most interesting thing is that after 500 years of the first version of the Quran in Spanish, the second version was made by Professor Ahmed Aboud in Argentina. And we've got his grandson here, Professor Omar Aboud, who's the General Secretary of the Islamic Center, the Islamic Center of the Argentinian Republic. And of course, for us, it is an honor that we were invited to be representatives of Argentina here. And we can tell you that it is also an honor to be with you here. And we can also say that the work we've been developing specifically in Buenos Aires, but all throughout the Argentinian Republic, with regards the cross-religious dialogue, render many fruits. We even had conferences with the participation of both Muslims, Jewish and Christians, and most of the ideas we draw from those conferences are the parameters we found were developed while studying and following the guidelines settled down by the Al-Andalus of that Muslim Spain, at which the three monotheistic religions found a ground for dialogue and consider a normal thing to sit down around the table and reach agreements. And perhaps we can even have models, or, for example, the cantigas of St. Mary from the time of Alphonse X. We've got proof of it there. And as I was saying, we've got everything for that to be not just reenacted, but for it to be done even better. And perhaps the motto for us would be to rethink Al-Andalus. Thank you.
Muchas gracias a Shamsuddin Elías, que con su disertación viene a confirmar lo que estábamos.
Thank you very much. So this is to go back to what we were saying at the beginning. Alliance of civilization, transcendental humanism, universalism are constant features in our history. Al-Andalus is a historical reference point for that process. We're now going to give the floor to Jacob Bender, who's a film director. As we said before, he's working on a project about Averroes and Maimonides here in Córdoba.
Salam alaikum. Shalom aleichem. I am most honored to speak to you today as a Jew and an American in this magnificent city of Córdoba, a place where once long ago Muslims, Jews, and Christians lived together in peace. Córdoba and two of its most illustrious sons, the Muslim Ibn Rushd, known in the West as Averroes, and his Jewish counterpart, Rabbi Musa ibn Maimun, known in the West as Maimonides, are the subjects of the documentary film I am now directing. Córdoba was once, after all, the most advanced city on the entire European continent, housing hundreds of mosques and synagogues, libraries, gardens, and street lighting, a place that a Christian visitor in the 11th century described as the ornament of the world. Here, philosophers and physicians, mathematicians and musicians, astronomers and architects of different faiths collaborated in exploring the mysteries of the universe and the nature of the divine, seeking to harmonize reason and revelation, a task still confronting us some 8 centuries after Averroes and Maimonides. Los sabios de Córdoba, the wise men of Córdoba, were born in this city in the 12th century. The goal of my film and my dream has been to bring this message of convivencia out of Córdoba to audiences around the world, offering them insight into the civilization that was Al-Andalus. One of the advisors of my film, Father David Burrell, a Catholic priest and professor of philosophy at the University of Notre Dame in the United States, writes that from the 10th century onward, religion in the West was an interfaith endeavor. This is an astonishing statement and can help us find a way out of the so-called clash of civilizations that some intellectuals perched dangerously close to the centers of power in Washington and London have superficially imposed upon our air. Father David's statement means that Islam and Judaism are not foreign antibodies infecting the purity of Christian Europe, but to the contrary, that Muslims, Jews, and Christians together wove the fabric that we now call Western civilization. To really understand the West as a multi-faith construction from its birth is to bring new light to the so-called problems of the hijab, the relation between Turkey and the European Union, and the question of the so-called integration of millions of new Muslim immigrants into Western Europe. How tragic that when we look around the world today, convivencia, the spirit of coexistence of Al-Andalus, all undertaken, has been replaced. The spirit of coexistence of Al-Andalus has been replaced by wars, occupation, extremism, and hatred, all undertaken in the name of religion. President Bush calls the illegal and unjustified invasion of Iraq a crusade. Israel destroys thousands of Palestinian homes to make room for extremist settlers who believe God promised the Holy Land to the Jews alone. Violent extremists target Madrid, London, Bali, and bomb synagogues in Istanbul and Tunisia, all justified, they believe, by the Holy Quran. And fundamentalists in the United States, armed with the Bible in one hand, attack scientific research with the potential to save hundreds of thousands of lives. To call today for the rebirth of Al-Andalus is not to call for a rebirth of the Caliphate, nor is it a romanticizing of Muslim Spain, which was never a perfect society. I believe, however, that we can discover in the historical experience of Al-Andalus and medieval Spain, and in the biographies and writings of Averroes and Maimonides, jewels of knowledge and gems of wisdom that can help us as we confront the myriad problems that we humans, men and women, now face at the dawn of our new century. We should note here as well the special role that Spain and His Excellency Foreign Minister Moratinos have played in offering friendship to both Israel and Palestine and to Arabs and Jews the world over. This solidarity, I believe, draws special inspiration from Spain's unique multi-faith heritage and is a crucial part of the alliance of civilizations in which Spain has been so important. Indeed, especially for we Jews around the world, the rediscovery of our roots in Spanish soil can have an astonishing impact. For years, those who have peddled the so-called clash of civilizations have also argued that there is an eternal war between Jews and Arabs and Jews and Muslims. The legacy of Cordoba and Al-Andalus is proof just how mistaken this notion is. On the contrary, for hundreds of years, Jews were an accepted part of the Ummah, the Muslim community stretching from Barcelona to Baghdad. And Arabic was, in fact, also a Jewish language, as countless Jews contributed to Islamic civilization as philosophers and physicians and poets, even military commanders. Just one example. In the year 2000, Al Gore chose Senator Joseph Lieberman, an Orthodox Jew, as his running mate for vice president. American Jews and other commentators try to outdo each other in their praise of, quote, American tolerance, and to argue that in no other country had Jews reached such heights. Yet, over 9 centuries ago, here in Muslim Spain, a Jew named Shmuel Hanagid was vizier or prime minister of the Muslim-ruled state of Granada and the military commander of her armies for over 30 years. I know this audience will also be most pleased to learn that there are now dozens of Arab Jewish and Jewish Muslim dialogue groups and projects in the United States seeking to learn from the legacy of medieval Spain and its culture of coexistence. One such project is Abraham's Bridge, a traveling Jewish Muslim dialogue that I have created with Professor Saeed Khan, an American Muslim scholar and professor of Islamic Studies in Detroit. Together, Professor Khan and I have been traveling to universities and colleges, synagogues, mosques, and churches to bring our message of Jewish-Muslim reconciliation to these audiences, helping to counter both Islamophobia and anti-Semitism. Changing the ingrained prejudices of both of our communities will not be easy, but as our sacred writings teach us, knowledge is the key to change, not coercion, which, as this audience well knows, coercion is specifically forbidden by the Quran in matters of religion. I have seen the impact it makes upon Jewish and other audiences in the United States to learn that there are Muslim organizations like Junta Islámica of Spain that have specifically condemned the atrocities committed by Al-Qaeda in the name of Islam. And I have seen the impact it makes upon Muslim audiences when they learn that there are thousands of Jews around the world, like myself, who have consistently condemned Israel's 40-year-long occupation of Palestine, with its ethnic cleansing, its destruction of Arab homes and orchards, its targeted assassinations, and its choking checkpoints. One such group is Rabbis for Human Rights in Israel, whose leaders have blocked with their own bodies Israeli bulldozers attempting to demolish Palestinian homes, and have been arrested and sent to prison by Israeli courts and police. Please be clear, those of us who support the rights of the Palestinian people, often at great personal risk, as we have been called traitors and self-hating Jews by our own community, we do so not because we are alienated from Jewish tradition, but because we accept the Jewish obligation to seek justice in the world and free the oppressed. Looking to the future, I hope and pray that Muslims, Jews, and Christians, inspired by the legacy of Cordoba and the spirit of Al-Andalus, will pledge that all resorts to violence are contrary to our shared religious traditions, for ultimately violence inflicts grievous harm on all sides of the conflict. I hope and pray that the religious symbols and traditions held sacred by billions of human beings around the world will not be held up for ridicule and derision. And I hope and pray that the sufferings of Jewish and Muslim history, whether of my fellow Jews in the Nazi Holocaust or of the Palestinian people in the Nakba, the catastrophe that befell Palestine during the birth of Israel in 1948, will never again be questioned, neither in Tehran nor in Tel Aviv. And finally, permit me to conclude with a verse from the Quran. In the name of Allah, the merciful, the compassionate. For every one of you, Jews, Christians, and Muslims, we have appointed a path and a way. If God had willed, he would have made you but one community. But that he has not done, in order that he may try you in what has come to you. So compete with one another in good works. So compete with one another in good works. For me, an American Jew and an artist, my film is an attempt in good works, an attempt to build bridges of understanding, illumination, enlightenment, and compassion. And I am most thankful to this esteemed audience for allowing me to speak to you today about Out of Cordoba. Thank you. Muchas gracias. Toda rabba. Shukran.
Muchas gracias, Shukran, Jacob, por esta disertación tan emotiva y tan bella sobre las posibilidades de diálogo y de entendimiento entre las distintas religiones y las distintas culturas. Como estamos viendo, todos los que estamos interviniendo en esta mesa, estamos reconociendo de alguna manera que existen antecedentes de esa forma universal de concebir al ser humano, y que esa visión ha estado vigente en esta tierra durante mucho tiempo, o al menos durante algún tiempo. También estamos viendo y estamos reconociendo que ese espíritu es inherente a la forma islámica de vivir, y que esa universalidad está presente en todas las tradiciones espirituales y religiosas genuinas de todas las culturas del mundo. Ese reconocimiento, esa identidad, de alguna manera, es la que hizo posible no solamente la sociedad andalusí, sino los demás ejemplos que en diversos momentos y lugares han existido a lo largo y ancho del planeta. A continuación, vamos a ceder la palabra a Antonio Manuel Rodríguez Ramos, que está a mi derecha, que es jurista, que es profesor de Derecho Civil de la Universidad de Córdoba, que va a tratar los aspectos, yo no diría jurídicos, pero sí un poco más legales, ¿no?, de este tema, de este problema identitario, con el tema de la identidad cultural y la ciudadanía universal. Adelante.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Yo voy a ser breve. Mi planteamiento de entrada es el de coincidir básicamente con mi compañero de mesa y el de proponer de antemano a la organización, a la que agradezco el participar, que os nombre a todos héroes civiles por estar todavía aquí sentados siendo la hora que es. Y partiendo de eso, yo creo que, como si decía Ibn Khaldun, que el pasado y el presente se parecen como dos gotas de agua, yo creo que el verdadero problema es que no somos capaces de ver que es idéntico. Y si no somos capaces de ver que el pasado y el presente es igual, tampoco voy a culpar a las personas que no lo ven, sino que es muy probable que tengamos una venda en los ojos puesta que nos impide ver que, como decía Ibn Khaldun, el pasado y el presente es igual, es el mismo. Agradezco en consecuencia a la organización y al liderazgo popular islámico mundial oportunidades como esta para que empecemos por lo menos a hablar, para que el ciego sensorial, el que tiene la venda, por lo menos crea que su derredor no es el mismo. Pero creo que lo más importante es que, además de que nos convenzan con la palabra, hacen falta hechos. José Saramago, hace muy poco tiempo, denunciaba cómo la intelectualidad contemporánea anda cruzada de brazos. Ya no es solamente que no opine, es que no hace, no se mueve. Lo que quiero decir con todo esto es que a lo mejor la intelectualidad contemporánea, además de hablar, tendría que hacer el esfuerzo de utilizar las manos para quitar la venda. Digo todo eso porque las propuestas de Alianza de Civilizaciones, que me parecen muy hermosas, muchas veces quedan en el éter, en el vacío, porque no hay propuestas concretas que determinen realidades tangibles. Es muy hermoso. Me enorgullece contemplar como la Universidad Al-Ándalus.
I think it's wonderful to see how you can see examples of architecture from Al-Andalus in Peru and in Argentina, and I can see how in Africa Muslims wash themselves in the same way as my father did. But that is wonderful, but it doesn't really help to see that we used to live here all together. This is invisible because all these generalist ideas about an alliance of civilizations are not materializing in anything. There are no specific projects. I was listening before and I was thinking, what shall I do? What shall I say? I could give you a general reflection about universal approaches to change the world order, but I think that this is paradoxical, that the humanity today, which is a universal political subject, people feel guilty because when they plug the fridge on, they're changing the climate. We feel worried about waste in space because we think it's ours. But we are instrumental subjects. We can communicate by internet all over the world. However, but we've But at the same time, society has never been so individualistic. As though we can communicate through internet, but we don't do anything to change the world. Why am I saying all this? Because I don't really believe in this distribution of world structures that came about after the Second World War. I don't believe in the nation state. I don't believe in the fact that an oligarchy of states without any cultural organ or identity should have kidnapped the democracy in the world, that the World Bank should have so much power. I'm very concerned about all this, and I think what we need is to put forward solutions. There are utopian solutions. I could say that, okay, all citizens in the world should have universal citizenship. I could put forward today here that instead of having vertical structures, we should have horizontal structures. I could also say here today and propose that there should be a world meeting, not of nation states, but of structures based on cultural entities that, using their freedom, want to become political entities, and they could be territorially based or not. They could be based on gender, on religion, on universalist religions. I could put all this forward today, but it would all be utopian. But having listened to what my colleagues have said, I want to be much more simple and put on some specific proposals on the table. And specific proposals must be linked to cultural identity that I feel are still alive. And as Ibn Khaldun said, Al-Andalus is one. My proposals are that the proceedings of this conference should go to the high-level group for the Alliance of Civilizations and the regional government and the central government here in Spain with the following proposals. First of all, there should be institutional support for the proposal that I sent to the regional parliament so that Moriscos should have the same right as Sephardite descendants or any descendant of any historical community linked to Spain. This proposal was actually admitted by the parliament, but they can't include it on the agenda because it hasn't got the support of 3 political groups within the parliament. It was put forward by the left-wing coalition in September 2006. I'm not talking about utopia here as things that didn't exist. It was put forward by one political party. It had the support of the Andalusist support. But the Socialist Party, who are the ones who supposedly set up the Alliance of Civilizations, did not support it. And I wanted it to go to the central government. It's so symbolic. One single word included in the civil code would reconcile 500 years of historical injustice. It's one single word, which would imply a revolution. If Article 25 of the Spanish Civil Code said that the Spanish nationality was going to be given to those who had lived for 2 years and who were were citizens of Latin American countries, the Philippines, Sephardis, and if we could add the citizens of Al-Andalus, that would solve this. Then the Declaration of Chauen. I proposed this idea in Chauen, and I contributed specific measures to implement it. And they are exactly the same as those that the descendants of Sephardite Jews have. What do they consist of? The creation of an office of experts that accredit the fact of being a descendant, in this case of Al-Andalus. This could be created perfectly well, and this measure was supported at the second meeting of Alliance of Civilizations in Chauen. And at that meeting, where there were many high-level representatives from many different countries, including Spain, which Spain, through this channel, also should ratify this proposal, then, so that it's not only a proposal and it should be included as a legislative measure to be implemented. Then economic and organizational support to hold in January 2008, something that was already agreed upon in the WILP meeting in Niger for the World meeting for the recovery of the memory, the historical memory in Al-Andalus. And here in Cordoba, it would be wonderful if here in Cordoba, descendants of citizens of Al-Andalus could all come together, not only from the north of Africa and Morocco and Chawan and Tetuan and Fez, but also from Libya, Tunisia, in the Philippines, in America. If they could all come together, even if it was only for one weekend, there wouldn't be any kind of problem. And it would be very wonderful to see, like Ismail Diaidi, who is the curator of the most important library in Timbuktu in Mali, where all the manuscripts are, is a descendant of Al-Andalus, and he can prove it. And our friend Al-Akal, who still has the key to his house in Granada, and it would be wonderful for us to see it. But we know this, but it would be even better for everybody else to see it, all the other people who are not aware of this. And this is easy. It will be it won't be expensive. It would be symbolic, the amount of money that would have to be invested here. But this gesture would be much more useful than all the words that are lost in the air, because this would help us to visualize things. It would take the blindfold off some people's eyes. Another measure that I would like to be put forward and applied in practice is support for a declaration which I drafted in April 2007 and was signed by Vicente Amigo and Samira Kadir, amongst others. And that is to support the bid for Andalusi music and flamenco as intangible heritage of humanity. The Al-Andalus music was exported and gave rise to part of the Renaissance, and is still songs that are still sung in Libya, Tunisia, Greece, and other places. This Andalusi music, which became pain when, after the conquest of the flamenco, the laborers without any land, they were thrown out. It's not a coincidence that all flamenco songs start with I, because this is the reflection of pain. So they should be, we should apply for them to become candidates. They should become candidates to be universal heritage. But this has already been done, but it was rejected. But I would like to say that this should continue. It should continue, because pain is universal, that expropriation is universal, and it can't ever be forgotten. And that Andalusian music, with all its Renaissance wealth all over Europe and all over the world, and the declaration says as follows: the music in Al-Andalus the speaker is reading a declaration which is extremely poetic, and the interpreters have not had it beforehand, so it cannot be translated. The music from Al-Andalus has never stopped being heard. Even after the expulsions, the people who were expelled took it with them all over the world, from the beaches of Tetuan from Alaska to Tierra del Fuego, from Greece to the Philippines, and Andalusian music became the best way to define Andalusian and universal feelings. Flamenco. Etymologically, flamenco comes from falah y menkub in Arabic, which mean landless peasants that had been discriminated against and whose lands had been taken away. Andalusian music represented universal pain of the person who has got nothing, like as though one's throat was filled with blood. And for all those reasons, we feel that flamenco and Andalusian music should be considered intangible heritage of humanity. And we urge the authorities to support this bid because it is a question of justice to cure the wounds that were inflicted. And I could add another proposals, but with these 5 proposals, I think we could carry out an unforgettable symbolic gesture, and we could move forward. We could do now what hasn't been done in the last 500 years, take our blindfolds away and recognize ourselves.
Muchas gracias, Antonio Manuel.
Thank you very much, Antonio Manuel, for this very in-depth and interesting talk. I'd now like to ask Carmen, who has finally decided that she is going to take the floor, to talk to us about this proposal to recover the identity of Al-Andalus.
Voy a ser muy cortita.
I'm going to be very brief because such wonderful things have been said here. Rather than speaking, I think I feel as I'm going to cry. But my speech is called A Proposal for Europe. Recovering the spirit of Al-Andalus. These brief words are a contribution on behalf of the Garnata Medieval Foundation to the extraordinary work being presented at this meeting here in Córdoba on the Alliance of Civilizations. We are people who belong to an Al-Andalus which has never been forgotten. Memory didn't burn. It is the name of, this is the slogan and the leitmotif of our foundation. Even though over hundreds of years, a history that is not ours has been imposed on us. As this history is being told, it's obviously subjective. History is always subjective, but obviously anthropology and the genetic memory of peoples is very different. We don't want to remind the grandeur of the past just for the sake of it. We want to see how we can look at the main lines of an analysis that's applicable to today's society, looking at it against the background of what Al-Andalus was, to see if this can be useful for us. And I would like to put forward and read to you part of the preamble of a text that was written by Kim Pérez, which is called Al-Andalus. And Andalus are all the human groups that lived in Al-Andalus, the Christian Mozarabs, the Muladiyes, Muslims, which were descended from the peninsula, the Arabs and the Berbers, the Jews. Over this year, a historic event has taken place since Al-Andalus has reappeared in Valencia, Murcia, Andalusia, and Catalonia. Thousands of North Africans have obtained Spanish papers. Mosques have been built. And some of them are very solemn and beautiful, such as the one in the M30 or in Madrid or Granada. A few days ago, I understood that this fact should be integrated into a new understanding of the history of Spain and that of Al-Andalus, which is now being merged into one, which should not be the Spain of the Christian community or the Islamic community, but rather a mixture, a respectful mixture of both traditions. I would like to state that the new blood has already been spilt, that of the 11th of March. And there are many threats from Al-Qaeda wanting to constitute an excluding Al-Andalus. This, we are looking for the way forward towards good, and this helps me to understand how urgent this task is. I have mentioned with this the Moriscos of Rioja, who resisted and were faithful to their faith for over 500 years as a symbol of other unknown communities. Rioja is a small village in Jaén, is a witness to the fact that Islamism in Spain is constantly here. 1,300 years of resistance, survival, and a victory over oppression. I've also rewritten the text about the second Mudejares, who wanted to give a historical name and a continuity to today's immigration, which is a natural, constant feature of both sides of the Straits of Gibraltar and one of the most important phenomena of contemporary history. This is where Kim Perez ends. She talks about the prodigy of the North African immigrants working as laborers all over the country and have promoted Islam amongst us. For me, the prodigy is the reappearance of Al-Andalus with the muladis of the 20th century. Thanks to the Constitution of 1978, they have been able to breathe freely. And the García, los Escudero, the Muñoz and the Flores, the Cugat, the Pérez and the Prados, the Cocas, los Carrascos, Cabreras, Castiñeras, all these people who are muladíes, these are all muladí surnames, and they have been out to come to the surface and be public since 1978. This is the future and the fertile ground to construct a welcoming area for the thousands of Muslims who come from abroad. These natives who've gone back to the faith of their ancestors in a spontaneous way are the real leaders of peaceful coexistence that it is urgent to construct. They have a lot to do. They have a lot of responsibility to history. The history of peoples is repeated and repeated. It's like an elastic that's pulled and pulled and pulled. But then it goes back to its original shape. And I haven't read Ibn Khaldun yet. Another current issue is how Europe is facing up to the problem of what is called the Turkish problem. I would recommend you to read Franco Caldini and Islam, published in 2002. And this will help me to sum up the presentation of this study. There are states in Europe which frown at the prospect of Turkey entering Europe. Why? Why? And now the editor says, when the third millennium of the Christian era is beginning, Islam will knock on our doors again, as it did between the 7th and 8th centuries. Caldini reflects lucidly about the relations and the exchanges between Europe and Islam, which were very frequent, very fertile and very friendly, but have almost always been seen based on a hostile prejudice, gratuitous prejudice from seeing Muhammad as a Christian heretic or seeing Islam as diabolic force. And this has been exacerbated since the 11th of September. Caldini can help us to consider that nothing that we want today is new. But nothing that we're proposing is new. It already existed, but we destroyed it little by little with the idea of trying to impose uniformity of customs and laws. This makes things more comfortable and easier for whoever's in power to dominate us. Cardini says we can't consider Europe and the Muslim as two different facets of the same civilizations, but two different civilizations, both rich and that can live together with a strong Euro-Asian, Mediterranean, Hellenistic root.
Tiene un papel muy especial, extremo occidente de Oriente, sede de una civilización islámica de las más ricas, civilizadas, cultas y tolerantes que se hayan dado nunca en 14 siglos de historia musulmana.
As no one else, no other else in all the history of a Muslim. And this is the end of the quotation of Cardini. Cardini then goes on to listing a series of crusades, encyclicals against the Islamic domination, the first crusade against Jerusalem, by that time in Muslim hands, which conquered Europe in 1009. And also the Turkish Islamic power was also manifested as a menace. And the coming and going of this Muslim Turkish power in Europe with states which opened to the invader while giving deaf ears to the voice of the Pope, were to open the doors. In the end, we're all fighting for the economy, but let it be fair and horizontal, as it was said here. We cannot forget mentioning the role of the Order of St. Francis in the 13th century, with St. Francis and Raymond Lull, who would deserve a different study. We entered the 14th century in 1346. The Turks won over the Crusaders. In 1463, the Bosnians of Greek Orthodox embrace Islam en masse and brought Islam into Europe. We could continue listing other conquests, such as Negroponto, etc. In 1480, under the orders of the Vatican, it was that in Castile, the new Inquisition was established in Castile in order to control the newly converted Christians. It could not be admitted that Europe was bleeding its blood in wars against the enemies of the faith, and the Catholic kings would be in Spain protecting the Jewish and the Muslims. The thesis of Rome was that an enemy of the cross is an enemy of Europe. As the invention of the sacred Holy Empire had failed, the Vatican wanted to unite Christianity After calls for pacts with the Greek Orthodox Church, the people say that they prefer the turban to their tiara. And no union of the Christian churches was achieved in order to fight against the Turks. And also take into account the later reform of the church started by Martin Luther when the Turks were at the doors of Vienna. The Christians, bored out with so many alms forgiven the sins of so many crusades and all the fighting, all that led to a division in Christianity with the reform of the Lutherans. This is read in order to avoid that to happen today, division. So that's why we study it a little bit, for it not to happen again. And we cannot but remember Erasmus from Rotterdam with his writings against these wars, who would refer to wars as foolishness. He even referred to those wars as a foolishness, even in the case of the war against Turks. He would say that following the faith of Jesus Christ was the most consistent way to win over the Turks. But it seems that Christians had more weapons than virtues, if we follow what was written by the time. After the taking of Rhodes and Belgrade by the Turks in 1587, diplomatic relationships were established between England and the Ottoman Empire up to 1856, through which the Treaty of Paris, the penetration of Western capital into Turkey was guaranteed. We're coming back onto economy, and we're all having to refer to economy in the end. The Turkish power became weakened in Europe by that period because of the economic racing, and which was promoted by the sultans. Europe starts to become industrialized, but that was not the case with the Turks. Taking advantage of that economic opportunity, Europe enters the Turkish economy, and Turkey tried to live off the economic profits, and that was its end. Rome was still saying that Europe was running the danger of becoming Islamicized. And today, even if we do not see it, Europe is becoming Islamic more and more, very slowly, without any fighting. We accept the ways for peaceful coexistence, or globalization will not be true, will not made true. And to finish, let's get back to the Al-Andalus. If these transference of ideas among the cultures up to configuring a very different civilization to that of the European Christendom is not utopia, is a reality which should be overcome. The true model for the current problems is to be found in the Al-Andalus. The eyes of us all are turned to Cordoba as a symbol. Cardini, who's an Italian, is a specialist in medieval times, started his thesis on Europe before Islam while evoking the Andalusian model. We hope these contributions are a turning point for reflection, so we have a clear focus on tasks which are to be accomplished today. Europe is lucky enough to have the seal, the trail of Islamic civilization among its own characteristics.
Muchas gracias, shukran.
Thank you, Shukran, Carmen, for this passionate talk on Al-Andalus and such a deep view, an insight into our history. And now we're going to start a Q&A session, and we'd like to invite you all to ask questions if you want. And also, if you want to make your questions, please just tell who of the speakers you would like to address, and we'll try to answer in within the framework of our own possibilities. It's a comment. My name is Luis Miguel from the Rajed Order of Mexico. Touching in my heart, the words by on Andalusia touch my heart, and looking for reference in my own reality, I reached the following conclusion. The identity shown in Andalusia, in Al-Andalus, as a form to give shape to coexistence of monotheistic, although so-called monotheistic religions, generates a kind of discourse. A discourse at which can see that the identity referred to in Andalusia came to an arrest at a time, at a moment where the spiritual experience of coexistence was to be felt. The question for any of the members of the panel is, which is the specific legacy you can perceive, you can see in your heart now and here, which could help the dialogue of civilizations from your experience. For those people who are not from Andalusia, people like us who have no territorial ties or links, even if we have received the spiritual infusion, for example, in America, the infusion of these of such experiences.
Para contestar
in order to just partially answer what you were saying, first, we should be more precise in the terms we use. When I talked, I never referred to Andalusia. I referred to Al-Andalus. Andalusia is a region. It's a geographic region in Spain, which hasn't got much to do with what we were referring to before. Al-Andalus is the Muslim Spain, whether it's different or throughout its different historic periods, with the Emirates of Cordoba, the Caliphate, and then the Taifas, ending down in the Nasri Sultanate. And those periods have a multiplicity of legacies. On the one side, we could refer to the spiritual legacy, from in which we may see the coexistence of the three monotheistic religions, and then another legacy, artistic, scientific, technical legacy, which was also expanded in all directions throughout the 5 continents. All that is still present, and we can see still very much alive. The question is to find it, to reinterpret it, and bring it to practical terms.
Yo, si me lo permitía, añadiría una reflexión sobre
I would like to add a reflection to that. I agree with Sanjuddin that Al-Andalus is not a geographic territory, but rather a spiritual reality.
Pienso que no podemos hablar solo del legado.
And I think we cannot just talk about the Andalusian legacy, but about the legacies, Andalusian legacies. Why do I say that? Because when we put back our eyes on Al-Andalus, we pay attention, we put our attention on what we have just described about that cultural, spiritual legacy. But the spiritual legacies, perhaps, which has been left more hidden, more secluded, and coming back to what we were saying at the beginning, and coming back to linking the problem of identity and alliance and dialogue with contemporaneity. What is true, the true legacy humanity needs is more in need of course, Al-Andalus is an example of it. That legacy is to recover the world of soul, of the spirit. The last 1,000 years of culture and civilization, which are, as we have been acknowledging, are tributaries of that reflection made by Muslims in the time of Averroes, started describing the world in terms of dualism, in terms of the shape and matter in Aristotelic terms, in terms of a duality with no solution. But from then on, the world of soul was left to a world which had more of poetry and art than of scientificism. It disappeared from thinking. So that's why I was referring to Ibn Mazara and the Brethren of Purity, because they continued with that view under which the world of the soul was taken into account, the spiritual world, the world of subtleties. So around that world is where that old view coincides with the world of quantum, with the world of vulnerability. And that's the legacy that, from my humble point of view, should be recovered if we really want the world to change. If we want also that apart from material development and apart from rational development, what we leave is a holistic, a full development of the human being.
Aprovechando lo que usted ha dicho.
Taking advantage of what you said when you referred to the Brethren of Purity, the Brethren of Purity reached their peak with the Banu Hud of Saragossa, but after Muqtadir, Ben Hus, did they disappear or did they scattered somewhere? Well, I'm not a historian, nor a historian of spirituality, so I do not know those that information. But I'm sure they had that deep influence in Ibn Baya, in Andalusian philosophy. Ibn Baya seems to be the one who introduced it in a formal way, but by that time their ideas, their thinking had already been disseminated all throughout the East. When Ibn Mazara, by the mid-10th century, traveled to the Middle East, that thinking had not been systematized, but it was taking shape. It happened in a way similar to what's happening today. That humanism, that alliance is not yet being defined, but there's a group of people meeting and looking for solutions. The specific question you made, I do not know it. It's just that later on in history, when once the time of the kings of Saragossa, I'm a historian, but I never heard anything else of them. Yeah, of course. That coincides with that mutation of thinking. We're talking about the triumph of Averroism because rationalism won over the soul. There's a Western myth of mutation, which is when Western modernity was referred to as the Faustic civilization. Modern positive science was defined as Faustic civilization. Faustus, and in the books of Goethe, wants to reach the subject of his desires, and he sells his soul to the devil, to Mephistopheles, and in return he obtains the object of his desire. But when he wants to enjoy it, he can no longer do that because he's lost his soul. So one of the most logical conclusions would be to recover the world of soul, to recover that holistic view at which all those dimensions of human being are taken into account. And the brethren of purity and also Mazarism disappeared, and Sufism, and Ibn Arabi went to the Middle East, and no more was heard of him. Of course, positive thinking had its positive consequences in the Western world, but during that process, the world of soul has been lost a little bit. Truly, I disagree a little bit on about trying to support one of these schools and forget about the other, or put mysticism against rationalism. I think the great triumph of Al-Andalus, in fact, was the appearance of multiculturalism. In fact, we could say that globalization, if well understood, it came not just because a traveler could cross throughout different countries without a passport, but rather that Islam, in all the regions it reached, together with that famous saying of the Prophet, look for signs even in China, he was not talking about something which was specifically referred to theology of philosophy, but to any kind of knowledge. When he said that, he was talking about a region which was yet untouched by China, a region which was yet untouched by Islam. Or when he said, look for knowledge, no take into account which is the recipient, the repository of it. So we can even find knowledge in an atheist. So Islam has got all schools inside because, in fact, all knowledge, be it rational or spiritual, comes from God. Knowledge doesn't come from one single way. It comes from the divinity, and that was the triumph of Islam. When trends denying the rest appeared, and where there were confrontation between mystics against scientists and philosophers against theologists, is when the Islamic civilization came to a collapse. And we had all that varieties, but when there were some, well, I like jasmine and that's best, and the other said, no, not jasmines, but roses. Roses are the best flowers, the best of flowers. That's the moment Al-Andalus was lost. So re-editing and rethinking Al-Andalus means adding up together everything. But Averroism doesn't have to do with Averroes. Averroes was a theologist and a philosopher. He was the most important judge of Al-Andalus. He was a judge in Seville and Cordoba. And the interpretation which was done of it in the 13th century in Paris has nothing to do with his thinking. But the most interesting thing is that thanks to Averroes and following Mr. Juan Bernet, Europe learned to think with Avicenna and Averroes, and he's a Neoplatonist and an Aristotelic put together, and they were two Muslim wise men. In order to, if we want to re-edit everything and make things clear, rationalism, if well understood, come from Islam, and that's what we must think of. But at the same time, we should add everything else, Ibn Arabi, all schools gathered together, all scientists, and sat down with the rest and find that what the Prophet referred to when he said that knowledge is everywhere, even in China, because the monotheistic model is also got to do with that being who's one and a multiplicity of different elements. We're many women and men, but we're just one single community, and it's a very difficult task, but there's no other way. I'm going to be very brief, but just to fuse what Ricardo said, and also in order to answer your first question, I want to refer back to contemporaneity, to our present day. And as Ricardo said, Europe started thinking with Averroism, but stopped thinking. We came from the time of heart to the time of the mind, and now we are coming back to the time of instincts. We're stopped thinking and feeling, and we're just enjoying. When the human being is treated as an animal, he can only develop instincts. We're now facing a simplification of culture. It is true that Andalusia is not Al-Andalus. Andalusia is a cultural substrate prevailing despite the civilizations falling on top of it. The same thing can happen to a people with the same powerful cultural substrate. So Carmen was saying, because also a sentence from Infante, Andalusia is a palimpsest. Andalusia has kept its substrates despite everything which came on top of it. In modern contemporary music, if they come to Andalusia, every single piece of music is fused or absorbed by Andalusia. Even pop groups like Los Planetas now, they follow flamenco music. So in the even chill-out music, and the cultural substrate is very powerful. But there are many peoples in the planet which do not have such a powerful substrate. The houses in Andalusia, popular houses, are usually painted with a fringe
cordobesa o andaluza, que no es la proporción
board which protects them. For the Greek, a golden proportion, excellency, dimension, the idyllic dimension of things is the one measuring the proportion between the side and the radius of a sin. But the proportion for measuring things here in Andalusia didn't correspond to it, but rather with the side and the radius of an octagon. And that means that from a very old time, from time of the Tartessian civilization, where 1 to 10, the proportion was 1 to 10, the same proportion as the pyramids in Mexico, and the same proportion all monuments keep in Cordoba, be them Christian or Muslim. So the people painting houses and who do not know anything of these, their face adapt the shade, and they follow the same proportion. And it's the shade which is projected by an object at the equinox of spring. So it's a natural shape of looking at the world. as long as that way of preserving your foundations is that your people will not be in danger. Perhaps Andalusia is still resisting, but I can promise you that in 25 years, Andalusia has changed more than in 400 years. And we're just saying that that cultural identity should be kept because predation is more and more intensive. And politically, you have got to be either white or black. And bipolarity is spreading like a cancer all throughout the planet. And that's what the Clash of Civilizations is about. It means the destruction of minorities, destruction of cultural diversity. What we're doing today is saying, no, there's no cultural uniformity. There's no A and B, like the famous conversation between Ibn al-Arabi and Averroes. There's no yes and no. There's also the maybe, colors, chromaticism, kaleidoscopic society. That's what should be preserved. And that's what we think is reaching to a point of exhaustion in Andalusia. There are many peoples in the world which are losing that. When you see the pictures at the United Nations, everyone is dressed with a suit and tie, or you see pictures from Nigeria, and all children have a T-shirt with the colors of the Real Madrid.
La verdad es que lo que
What I'm going to say is when you were talking about Averroism, I was thinking about this. What I want to say supports really what you're saying. In the case at the moment of the new thinkers in Islam, many establish the beginning of the Ummah through the recovery of Averroes, such as Jabiri. And not only Jabiri, many others too. Then also a quote from Averroes, in which he didn't establish contradiction between the two truths. The truth doesn't contradict the truth. This is a kind of synthesis which goes beyond this apparent contradiction. And that's all. Thank you. Yes, and I would like to thank our colleague here for this this detail. It's not Averroes, it's Averroism. No, Averroes never spoke about two truths. This is a fiction that's been invented even by the enemies of Averroism. What he said was, through reason, revelation is confirmed. But he never spoke about the two truths. That's total fiction, the business about the two truths. He never spoke about two truths. Even the Averroists didn't even speak about this. This was used to stigmatize the Averroists movement. So but where did this come from? Where does this distinction appear then? Well, what happened was that after a time, after a specific sporadic historical events such as wars, and then the Reformation and the Counter-Reformation, the Enlightenment, all this led to the appearance of philosophers who were exclusively rationalist, totally divorced from any spiritual aspect, and they moved on to the positivism of the 19th century and materialism. But positivism, which was had nothing to do with even theological thought, such as Descartes, Kant. And then we came to other thinkers who were even much worse, who took us to the present-day situation. But as a counterpoint to Averroes, we saw the rationalism, which is practiced by different Muslim philosophers, not only in the West but also in the East. And in fact, this revolutionized thought and produced an early Renaissance, which we could see in the 14th, 15th century in Europe, known as the Renaissance, but really it was the second Renaissance, because the Muslim involvement was never mentioned. Thanks to the Muslims, thought of the old masters was retransmitted. If you read the important philosophers, the first philosophers of the Honic school, whatever school they came from, Heraclitus or Plato, they all speak of the one, because the Greek philosophers didn't believe in the pantheon of Olympus. The Greek philosophers had a thought which was very similar to monotheism. So they spoke about the concept of one. In Baghdad, then, the Muslim philosophers had the Greek philosophers' books translated, and they read all this, and you could see where philosophy was leading to, which is to confirm the revelation. So that's why we have somebody like Al-Farabi, who simply wrote a book which is the Muslim version of the Republic by Plato, where it says that in the ideal state, the only ones who can be in charge of the state are the wise men, and which should never be the traders. But that's what we've got today, because he said that the only thing that the traders are going to do is to defend their own interests. This is what was said then. So there was nothing here about two truths. It's just that philosophy, through reason, confirms revelation. There is no wise Muslim of any school who said the opposite. But you know that history distorts things and changes discourses, and this is where confusions arise. Wasn't it Thomas Aquinas? No, there was something very interesting occurred with Thomas Aquinas and Albert Magnus. They started to deny philosophy, but they started to philosophize at the same time. And we can see this, that in Thomas Aquinas there's a reflection of Averroes' thought. But this is a confirmation of something that Aristotle said, of which he said those who deny philosophy are philosophizing. Well, there is a doubt here, which this is why this doubt arose. Why I asked the question? And in the meeting that Ibn Rata mentions, when he met Averroes in Cordoba, he says that Averroes was an old man. He was very mature. Ibn al-Arabi was a young man. And he says that in Seville he had a mystic experience and received enlightenment. And Averroes was his father's friend, and he told his friend to send his son to him, to invent some excuse so that Averroes could get to know him. Ibn Arabi says that when he arrived in Cordoba, when he arrived at Averroes' house, Averroes opened the door and said, "Yes?" And Ibn Arabi said, "Yes." So Averroes jumped and said, "Alhamdulillah." And Ibn Arabi looked at him and said, "No." And then Averroes asked the following question, and this is where my doubt arises. He asks him, "I know that you have lived this mystic experience, etc. That truth that you have found, is that truth that you have found the same truth that the philosophers are seeking?" if it were the same truth, then the same question shouldn't exist. That question would never have existed, because he would never have asked whether this was the case. Ibn Arabi said yes and no. Between the yes and no, the spirit leaves the body. So he is putting binary logic thought, dialectic scientific thought, in contact with a quantum mentality, in which an electron can and cannot, yes and no, all at the same time. Not yes or no, but yes and no. And from this is where I'm not a philosopher. I don't know a lot about philosophy, but this is what suggests to me that there was some kind of meeting here, or some kind of, meeting between two complementary ways of thinking.
I might add briefly, don't need, that's yes, no. I might add briefly that Maimonides Ibn Maimun also wrote the following sentence, that we must accept the truth from whatever source it flows. This is very similar to the quotations that you mentioned also, which are embedded in Islamic history in Al-Andalus. But it's also important to note that because of this, because of Maimonides' reliance on philosophy, on Aristotle, his books were burned not by Christians and not by Muslims, but by other Jews. And we must also remember that even though it happened for a short period at the end of his life, that the books of Averroes were also burned not by Jews, not by Christians, but by other Muslims. And there was a short period of banishment and exile at the end of his life. And for me, that means that sometimes, as much as we all value group solidarity and the love of our own communities, that sometimes we need to use our reason and our heart and to oppose and criticize those within our communities who commit injustice and sometimes violate the very precepts of the religion that we, Muslims and Jews and Christians, hold sacred. This is not an easy task, as Averroes discovered and as Maimonides discovered himself. But it's a task that I think is required and is obligated by our tradition if we are to be true to our tradition. That at a certain point, group solidarity breaks down and we are required to seek the truth even against our own families. Even against our own families, as hard as that may be.
With respect to what Mr. Jacob has said, there's something that's very, very interesting. There's a professor at the University of Miami. He's called Alan Cutler. And in 1986, he published a book called The Jew as Ally of the Muslim, Medieval Roots of Anti-Semitism. This book is something that's widely known by objective historians, not only in Al-Andalus, but in all the Muslim world. Jews and Muslims were close friends and colleagues, and they had something that they shared with their Christian brothers. But in all eras, there were people, and unfortunately, this is true for the Muslim world as well, who say that they're something they are not. There's a famous Muslim wise man who says something which is very true. which can be applied to all fields of thought. One thing is Islam, and another thing, Muslims are another thing. One thing is Judaism, and Jews are another thing. One thing is Christianity, and Christians are another. When the First Crusade came, those people who went with the idea of killing everybody, obviously, had very little Christianity in them. And this is what Cutler's book says, that the first crusade that went to the east to kill Muslims went through Germany. And on the way, when they went through Germany, they knew that Jews are very similar to Muslims, so they started to kill Jews in Germany. And on their way to the Crusades, on their way to the east, and this is what Cutler says, that the Crusaders saw the Muslims reflected in the Jews because they didn't eat pork, because they had different washing habits, etc., etc. So were these crusades really made up of real Christians? If we think this, we will be making a big mistake. Well, the speaker is not using the microphone. About the business of the two truths. If I'm not mistaken, it's Larousse. This is the text. There is a text which talks about this. I'm sorry. Let me finish, and then I'll let you speak. And what it says is the validity of the two instruments of thought, exegesis, hermeneutics, and reason. And then what Heshim said, my impression is that we're talking about diffuse logic of breaking off, of non-contradiction, of the center of Aristotle's philosophy. And there's a basis in the shahed. This is diffuse logic. The speaker is speaking in Arabic. I would just like to say again that this lie of the two truths came from certain theologians in Latin Christian Europe, because they tried to deny the philosophy. And I'm very clear on this. It's really incredible, but this happens and has happened throughout history, not only with Christianity or Islam, but in all cultures. A fiction is put about, a rumor is put about, a lie is put about, and people, members of a culture, believe it. It's a problem that occurred in the University of Paris, and there was nothing to do with Islam. They wanted to deny their philosophy, so they invented that Averroes spoke about two different truths. So this was a way of saying that he was saying that one thing was just the same as another. It didn't matter whether it was a lie or whether it was truth, etc. In this way, they tried to deny Averroes' philosophy and to acquire power over thought. And what is incredible here, a lot of Muslims who'd never read Averroes believed this. And they believed that Averroes then preached the double truth. But if you read Averroes, you'll see that Averroes never spoke about two truths. The only thing that he wanted, and is a right of Islamic thought, is the free reign of thought, that you can find the truth both through mystic experience and through reason, because both confirm the one. And yet this fiction is still being believed. Let's forget what was said in the 13th century in the University of Paris. Let's move to today. How many times do we believe easily what we are told by the telly or the rumors that we hear circulating? If we believe silly things like that, imagine how people will believe things in the 13th century and are still repeating these things today. what I would like to mention what Jacob said. I think it's basic. What he said is basic. It's essential. It doesn't matter. Debates don't matter as long as there's respect. We're talking about an alliance of civilizations, and we're in a forum in which the vast majority are Muslims, and we greet each other with the word peace. And I would like to remind you that that Switzerland was born with in the 13th century, which said that what brings us together is respect for difference. And what Jacob said so rightly is that truth can be fabricated because of interests. When a lie is supported by the majority, the truth is inverted. And I think that what we have to do is work together so that we can protect the truth, even if those of us who are telling the truth are a minority, because we are all the same. If we are in an alliance of civilizations and we have to make specific proposals, let's start by something so elemental as seeing that what brings us together is respect for what is different between us, so that we can see that this evil is an endemic evil that has got nothing to do with cultures and religions. And he said that what falls from the heavens and touches the ground is dead. What comes from the sea and floats is dead. And what emerges from everything and is solitary is dead. This is what is happening today. This is historical. This is always going to happen. And this conference helps us to protect ourselves. Those of us who, because the television every day is inviting us to be involved in the conflict of civilizations, and we are not dead. We must fight so that people can hear our voice. Thank you very much. I'd like to thank all of you. I've been told that the dinner is going to be at 10 o'clock and not 9 o'clock, inshallah. And thank you very much for your patience.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. El hermano Muhammad Mahfouz amablemente quiere ofrecernos a todos nosotros ahora una recitación del Corán y entonará algunos cantos andalusíes africanos, inshallah.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم وليحكم أهل الإنجيل بما أنزل الله ومن لم يحكم بما أنزل الله فأولئك هم الفاسقون وأنزلنا إليك الكتاب بالحق مصدقا لما بين يديه من الكتاب ومهيمنا عليه فاحكم بينهم بما أنزل الله ولا تتبع أهواءهم عما جاءك لكل جعلنا منكم شرعة ومنهاجا ولو شاء الله لجعلكم أمة واحدة ولكن ليبلوكم فيما آتاكم فاستبقوا الخيرات إلى الله مرجعكم جميعا فينبئكم بما كنتم فيه تختلفون وأن احكم بينهم بما أنزل الله ولا تتبع أهواءهم واحذرهم أن يفتنوك عن بعض ما أنزل الله إليك فإن تولوا فاعلم أنما يريد الله أن يصيبهم ببعض ذنوبهم وإن كثيرا من الناس لفاسقون أفحكم الجاهلية يبغون ومن أحسن من الله حكما لقوم يوقنون صدق الله العظيم. الفاتحة. رسول إله العالم الله 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 يا من يرى ما في الضمير ويسمع أنت المعد لكل ما يتوقع يا من يرى ما في الضمير ويسمع أنت المعد لكل ما يتوقع يا الله الله 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 يا من يرى ما في الضمير ويسمع أنت المعد لكل ما يتوقع يا من يرى ما في الضمير ويسمع أنت المعد لكل ما يتوقع يا الله الله 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 يا الله يا من يرجى للشدائد كلها يا من إليه المشتكى والمفزع يا الله الله يا الله 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 يا 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 الله 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 يا الله الله يا الله يا من خزائن رزقه بقول كن أمن فإن الخير عندك أجمع يا الله الله 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 يا 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 الله 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 ما لي سوى فقري إليك وسيلة فبالافتقار إليك فقري أدفع يا الله الله 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 يا الله يا الله 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 ما لي سوى قرعي لبابك حيلة ولئن رددت فأي باب أقرع يا الله الله 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 يا 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 الله 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 ومن الذي أدعو وأهتف باسمه إن كان فضلك عن فقيرك يمنع يا الله الله 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 حاشا لجودك أن تقنط عاصيا الفضل أجزل والمواهب أوسع يا الله الله 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 بالذل قد وافيت بابك عالما إن التذلل عند بابك ينفع يا الله الله 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 يا 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 الله 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 وجعلت معتمدي عليك توكلا وبسطت باليد سائلا أتشفع يا الله الله 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 يا 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 الله 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 فبحق من أحببته وبعثته وأجبت دعوة من به يستشفع يا الله الله 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 اجعل لنا من كل ضيق مخرجا والطف بنا يا من إليك المرجع يا الله الله 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 ثم الصلاة على النبي وآله خير الأنام ومن به يتشفع يا الله الله 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 لما رأيت لسان حالك قائلا يا سيدي أن ليس غيرك نافع يا الله الله 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 يا 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 الله 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 بلسان حالي قد دعوتك ضارعا أرجو جداك ولا لفضلك مانع يا الله الله 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 يا 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 الله 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 بالذات والسر المصون وباسمها لا كان عن رأي شذاها وازع يا الله الله 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 وصفاتها وسماتها الحسنى التي لم يحصها إلا العليم الواسع يا الله الله 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 يا 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 الله 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 وبنورها السار الذي من نوره أنوار كل النيرات سواطع يا الله الله 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 يا الله لا خاب لي بالمصطفى وحبيبه ظن ولا لاقيت ما أنا صانع يا الله الله 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 رسول إله العالمين تعالى رسول إله العالمين تعالى خديمك نادى يا رسول تعالى خديمك نادى يا رسول فلا أرى فقيرا إلى غير الإله تعالى الله 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 يا الله 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 يا الله خديم بأقصى الغرب يدعو محمدا وليس يرى غير الرسول ثمالا خديم ثواب الباب وهو مؤمل إيابا كريما وهو جير أطالا الله 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 يا الله 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 يا الله تصاغر عندي غير ذكر محمد تصاغر عندي غير أحمد إنني أرجي من الهادي العباد منالا كريم السجايا كريم السجايا واسع الجود ما ترى لضيف كريم قد أجاد مقالا الله 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 يا الله 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 يا الله كريم السجايا واسع الجود ما ترى لضيف كريم قد أجاد مقالا فهبه على مقدار كفك مصطفى البرايا عطاء لا يخاف زوالا الله 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 يا الله 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 يا الله ففي كل حي قد خبطت بنعمة وإني كشاس قد أروم نوالا عليك صلاة الله ثم سلامه وتشمل أصحاب النبي وآلا الله 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 يا الله 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 يا الله سبحان ربك رب العزة عما يصفون وسلام على المرسلين والحمد لله رب العالمين.
بسر وبركات الفاتحة.